On a scorching summer day in the year 260 AD, somewhere on the dusty plains near the city of Edessa in what is now southeastern Turkey, the most powerful man in the Roman world knelt in the dirt before his enemy, and the empire that had never known such shame would spend the next several centuries trying to forget it ever happened. This is the story of how a Roman emperor, the living embodiment of Rome's invincibility, became a living trophy in a foreign court, and how the empire that boasted of ruling the known world was forced to watch its own ruler used as a human footstool. To understand how Rome, a civilization that had crushed Carthage, humbled Greece, and stretched its authority from the fog-soaked hills of Britain to the deserts of Arabia, could suffer such a staggering blow, we have to travel back to a world in crisis, a world where two great empires stood on a collision course, each convinced of its own destiny to rule, and neither willing to back down. By the middle of the 3rd century, Rome was no longer the confident superpower it had once been. Historians often refer to this period as the crisis of the 3rd century, a roughly 50-year stretch during which the empire nearly collapsed under the combined weight of civil war, economic turmoil, plague, and relentless pressure on its borders. Emperors were rising and falling with dizzying speed, many of them murdered by their own soldiers within months of taking power, and the imperial treasury was being drained by the need to pay off increasingly mutinous legions. Meanwhile, far to the east, a new power had emerged from the ashes of the old Parthian Empire, Rome's longtime rival across the Euphrates. In 224 AD, a Persian nobleman named Ardashir I overthrew the last Parthian king and founded the Sassanid Empire, a dynasty that would rule Persia for the next 4 centuries and would prove to be a far more organized, centralized, and ambitious adversary than the Parthians had ever been. The Sassanids saw themselves as the true heirs of the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire, the empire of Cyrus the Great and Darius, and this self-image mattered enormously, because it meant the new Persian kings were not content to simply defend their borders. They believed they had a historical and even divine claim to lands the Romans had held for centuries, including much of the Near East. Ardashir began probing Rome's eastern frontier almost immediately, but it was his son, Shapur I, who would take this ambition to a level that would shake Rome to its core. Shapur I ascended the Sassanid throne around 240 AD, and many historians describe him as one of the most capable and ruthless rulers Persia ever produced, a king who combined military brilliance with a genius for propaganda, understanding that a victory only truly counted if the entire world knew about it. Shapur wasted little time asserting his ambitions. In the early 240s, he launched a campaign against Roman territory in Mesopotamia, and Emperor Gordian III marched east to confront him. According to Persian inscriptions, Gordian was killed during this campaign, though Roman sources tell a murkier story involving a mutiny among his own men. And this discrepancy is a reminder of how historical evidence from this era must often be weighed carefully, since Persian and Roman accounts frequently contradict each other for propaganda reasons. What historians generally agree upon is that Gordian's successor, Philip the Arab, was forced to negotiate a humiliating peace with Shapur, paying a massive sum to secure Rome's withdrawal, an early sign that the balance of power along this frontier was shifting. This was not merely a border skirmish. It was the opening chapter of a rivalry that would define the next several decades and would culminate in one of the most shocking events in Roman history. For Shapur, this early success only confirmed what he already believed about the weakness of a Rome consumed by internal chaos, and he began preparing for something far more ambitious than raids and border disputes. He wanted to strike at the heart of Rome's presence in the East, and he understood that Rome's greatest vulnerability was not its army, but its instability at the top. Every time a new emperor rose to power in Rome, it created a moment of uncertainty, a window during which the eastern frontier could be tested. Around 253 AD, a general named Valerian was proclaimed emperor by his troops, one of many such proclamations during this turbulent era, but Valerian managed to consolidate his power and became one of the more stable rulers of this chaotic period, at least for a time. Valerian faced enormous pressure from multiple directions at once, with Germanic tribes pressing against the Rhine and Danube frontiers in the west, while Shapur's Persia grew increasingly aggressive in the east. And he made the fateful decision to split imperial authority, elevating his son Gallienus to rule the western provinces while he personally led forces east to deal with the Persian threat. This division of responsibility reflected just how overstretched Rome had become, no longer able to rely on a single emperor to manage threats across its vast and increasingly fragile borders. Valerian arrived in the eastern provinces to find the situation dire. Shapur had already captured the great Roman city of Antioch, one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the entire empire, a center of trade, culture, and administration in the Roman Near East, and its fall sent shockwaves through the Roman world, since Antioch's capture meant Persian forces had penetrated deep into what should have been secure Roman territory. Valerian managed to push back and reclaim some lost ground, and for a moment, it seemed as though Roman resilience might once again prevail as it had so many times before against so many enemies. But Shapur was not finished, and in 260 AD, he moved against the city of Edessa, a strategically vital location that controlled key routes through Roman Mesopotamia, and this is where the story reaches its infamous turning point. Historical accounts, drawn primarily from later Roman and Byzantine historians such as Zosimus and Lactantius, along with the invaluable Persian perspective, preserved in a famous trilingual inscription carved into rock at Nakshi-Rustam near Persepolis, describe what happened next in ways that, while differing in detail, agree on the fundamental outcome. Valerian was captured by Shapur's forces. The exact circumstances remain a subject of historical debate, and this is where responsible storytelling requires acknowledging uncertainty rather than presenting speculation as fact. Some ancient sources claim Valerian was betrayed during supposed peace negotiations, lured into a trap while attempting to parley with Shapur, believing he could buy time or negotiate a withdrawal the way his predecessors had. Other interpretations suggest his forces were simply overwhelmed and encircled after a battle, possibly weakened further by an outbreak of plague that had been ravaging Roman troops throughout the campaign, a detail that adds a layer of tragic irony, since it suggests Rome's undoing may have come as much from disease as from Persian steel. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the outcome was undeniable and unprecedented. A reigning Roman emperor, for the first time in the empire's history, had been taken alive as a prisoner of war by a foreign power. To grasp just how staggering this was, it helps to remember what the office of emperor represented to Romans. The emperor was not simply a political leader. He was the physical embodiment of Roman power, dignity, and divine favor, often associated with the gods themselves, and his person was considered nearly sacred. Romans had endured emperors assassinated by rivals, poisoned by relatives, or killed in battle. But the idea of an emperor being captured alive and paraded as a trophy by a foreign king was almost unthinkable. A scenario so humiliating that many Romans initially refused to believe it, and later historians would struggle for centuries to process what it meant for Roman identity and self-perception. What happened to Valerian after his capture is where legend, propaganda, and historical uncertainty blend most dramatically, and where a careful storyteller must tread thoughtfully. The famous rock relief at Nakshi-Rustam, commissioned by Shapur himself, depicts the Persian king on horseback with a captive Roman emperor kneeling before him, sometimes interpreted as Valerian, grasping at his robes in a gesture of submission. This image, carved in stone and meant to last for eternity, was a powerful piece of political theater, a permanent monument broadcasting Persian dominance over Rome to anyone who beheld it. Later Roman and Byzantine sources, writing decades or even generations after the events, and often hostile toward Shapur for obvious reasons, added increasingly dramatic and likely exaggerated details. Most infamously the claim recorded by the historian Lactantius that Shapur used Valerian as a literal footstool, forcing the aged emperor to kneel down so that Shapur could step on his back when mounting his horse, and that Valerian was eventually killed in a gruesome manner. With some accounts even claiming his skin was removed, dyed, and displayed as a trophy in a Persian temple. Many historians today treat these more sensational details with significant skepticism, viewing them as later embellishments designed to emphasize the horror of Roman humiliation and to villainize Shapur for a Roman audience desperate to process this national trauma, rather than as verified historical fact. What can be said with greater confidence is that Valerian spent the remainder of his life in Persian captivity, and that his fate, whatever its exact details, became one of the most enduring symbols of imperial vulnerability in all of Roman history, a cautionary tale repeated for centuries about the fragility of even the mightiest power. The psychological and political shockwaves of Valerian's capture rippled far beyond the battlefield. For a civilization that had spent centuries cultivating an image of manifest destiny, of a divinely ordained mission to rule the world, this event was nothing short of catastrophic to Roman self-confidence. Gallienus, Valerian's son, now found himself sole emperor of a fractured realm, his own father a prisoner in a foreign court, and he faced an agonizing dilemma, since attempting to rescue or ransom his father risked further humiliation and military disaster, while doing nothing risked appearing weak and disloyal in the eyes of both his soldiers and the Roman public. Historical evidence suggests Gallienus made no serious attempt at a rescue, likely because the practical and military obstacles were simply too great given Rome's already overstretched resources, and instead he focused on holding together an empire that was disintegrating around him, with usurpers rising in Gaul, in the eastern provinces, and elsewhere, as regional commanders concluded that if the central government could not even protect its own emperor, it certainly could not protect them. In this vacuum of imperial authority, an unexpected hero emerged from the ruins of Roman prestige in the east. A local ruler named Odenathus, based in the wealthy caravan city of Palmyra in the Syrian desert, stepped into the chaos left by Valerian's capture and organized a remarkably effective military response against the retreating Persian forces, who had been raiding deep into Roman territory in the aftermath of their stunning victory. Odenathus, ruling what was technically still a Roman client state, achieved what the imperial legions themselves had failed to do, pushing Shapur's forces back across the Euphrates and even besieging the Persian capital at Ctesiphon on more than one occasion, restoring a measure of Roman prestige in the region, even as Rome's central government remained mired in crisis elsewhere. This episode is a fascinating footnote in the larger story, illustrating how the humiliation of Edessa created ripple effects that reshaped the political landscape of the entire Near East, eventually contributing to the rise of Palmyra as a major power under Odenathus's remarkable wife, Zenobia, whose own dramatic story of ambition and eventual defeat by Rome would unfold in the following decade. Meanwhile, back in Persia, Shapur I used his victory over Valerian as the crowning achievement of a broader propaganda campaign designed to cement his legacy as one of the greatest kings in Persian history, a worthy successor to Cyrus and Darius. The trilingual inscription at Nakshi Rustam, written in Middle Persian, Parthian, and Greek, so that it could be understood across his diverse empire and even by Roman travelers, catalogues his military triumphs in extraordinary detail, listing dozens of Roman cities captured and describing 3 separate victorious campaigns against Roman emperors, presenting Shapur's reign as an almost unbroken string of triumphs over the might of Rome. This inscription remains one of the most valuable historical sources we have for understanding Sassanid Persia's perspective on this conflict, offering a rare instance where we can compare a non-Roman account against the Roman historical tradition that has otherwise dominated our understanding of antiquity for centuries. It is worth pausing here to consider why this particular defeat has echoed through history so much louder than many of Rome's other military setbacks. Rome had suffered devastating losses before, from the annihilation of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in Germany to the catastrophic defeat at Carrhae 2 centuries earlier, when the Parthians destroyed a Roman army and killed the general Crassus. But the capture of a living, reigning emperor was categorically different, striking at the very concept of Roman invincibility in a way that battlefield deaths, however tragic, simply could not. It transformed an abstract military setback into an intensely personal and symbolic humiliation, one that could be depicted in art, referenced in propaganda, and used by Rome's enemies for generations as proof that the empire could be beaten, not just in battle, but in the person of its supreme ruler. The long-term consequences of this event extended well beyond the immediate crisis of the 260s. It exposed, in the starkest possible terms, the structural weaknesses that had been building within the Roman Empire for decades, including overextended borders, a fractured chain of command, and a political culture where military strongmen could seize power as easily as they could lose it. The crisis of the 3rd century would continue for another decade after Valerian's capture before a series of capable soldier emperors, beginning with Claudius Gothicus and culminating in the reforms of Diocletian, managed to stabilize and ultimately reorganize the empire, though Rome would never again enjoy quite the same unchallenged confidence it had possessed before Edessa. Diocletian's later reforms, including the division of imperial authority between multiple co-emperors, can be seen in part as a structural response to exactly the kind of vulnerability that Valerian's disaster had so brutally exposed, an acknowledgement that no single ruler, however capable, could realistically manage every threat facing an empire so vast and so beset by enemies on multiple fronts simultaneously. On the Persian side, the victory over Valerian helped establish a pattern that would define Roman-Persian relations for the next several centuries, a rivalry between two great powers that neither could fully conquer, locked in a long and exhausting cycle of war, negotiated peace, and renewed conflict that would continue in various forms until both empires were fundamentally transformed, the Romans by the rise of Christianity and the eventual split into Eastern and Western halves, and the Persians through the later transition from the Sassanid dynasty to the Islamic conquests of the 7th century. Some modern historians argue that this centuries-long rivalry between Rome and Persia, a rivalry decisively shaped by the shock of events like Valerian's capture, ultimately weakened both empires to the point where they proved unable to fully resist the sudden rise of Arab Muslim armies in the 7th century, an idea that remains debated among scholars, but which speaks to how a single dramatic event can send ripples of consequence stretching across centuries and continents. The story of Valerian's capture also offers a broader lesson about the nature of empire itself, one that resonates well beyond the specific details of 3rd century geopolitics. It is a story about the gap between the image a civilization projects and the fragile reality underneath that image, about how quickly perceived invincibility can collapse under the weight of internal division and external pressure, and about how a single dramatic moment of humiliation can reshape the trajectory of history in ways no one could have predicted at the time. It also stands as an enduring reminder that history is rarely written by only one side, and that the fullest understanding of any historical event requires weighing multiple perspectives against each other, in this case comparing Persian monumental propaganda against Roman historical memory, and separating verified historical fact from later embellishment, shaped by trauma, shame, and the very human desire to make sense of an unthinkable disaster. Today, the legacy of this ancient humiliation can still be traced in subtle ways. From the continued fascination historians and archaeologists have with the Naqsh-Rustem reliefs, which remain among the most studied monuments of the ancient Iranian world, to the way modern historians studying the decline of empires often return to the crisis of the 3rd century as a case study in how quickly great powers can be destabilized by a combination of internal weakness and external shock. The rivalry between Rome and Persia that this event intensified would go on to shape the political and cultural landscape of the Middle East and Mediterranean world for centuries, influencing everything from trade routes and religious developments to the eventual borders of nations that exist to this very day. Understanding this ancient clash between two superpowers reminds us that no empire, no matter how vast or seemingly permanent, is ever truly invincible, and that the wheel of history continues turning regardless of how confidently any civilization believes itself to be at the center of the world. The image of a Roman emperor kneeling before a Persian king, carved permanently into stone at Nakshi Rustam nearly 2,000 years ago, endures as one of history's most powerful reminders that pride, however justified it may seem in a given moment, always walks hand in hand with vulnerability, and that the greatest empires often fall not to a single crushing blow, but to a long accumulation of pressures that finally converge in one unforgettable moment of reckoning. If you found this deep dive into one of ancient history's most dramatic and lesser-discussed turning points fascinating, consider subscribing for more untold stories from history's greatest empires. Leave a like if you learned something new today, and share this video with anyone who loves uncovering the surprising twists hidden within the past.